And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. We're going to be reading our scripture lesson from 1 Samuel chapter 17. I'm going to be picking up from about verse 31 or 32 through verse 51. It's the story of David meeting Goliath in battle. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. Then the Philistine looked and saw David. He disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air, to the wild animals in the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and his face fell on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. So David ran and stood over the Philistine, grasped his sword, drew it out of the sheath, and killed him. Then he cut off his head with it. Story of David and the giant Goliath. Thanks be to God. The messages for the bulk of this year have been focused on stories for the ages. A look at some of the more popular and familiar Bible stories. Today we're going to take a quick look at David, the second of 3 kings that led a unified Israel, after Saul and prior to his son Solomon, who we'll explore a little bit more next week. When we hear about David, we may immediately think about the story of David and Goliath, but there is way more to know and learn about David than this story of a courageous and faith-filled boy taking out a giant. David first appears in 1 Samuel 16, when God informs Samuel that a new king will replace Saul and has been chosen. Samuel is told to visit Jesse and identify one of his sons. And like the story of Cinderella, David, Jesse's youngest, isn't there when Saul arrives. He's out tending the flock. I said Saul arrives, when Samuel arrives. He's out tending the flock when Samuel arrives and examines his brothers. But Samuel doesn't see the new king in any of them. He asks Jesse, "Are all of your sons here?" And David is brought out of the field. Samuel anoints David immediately as heir to the kingdom of Israel in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Soon after this, King Saul is frequently troubled and tormented by losing the favor of God. His servants seek someone who can ease and rest his mind with music during these bouts of depression. And a servant remembers David, who is not just spiritual, strong, and courageous, but is also an accomplished musician. About half the Psalms of the Bible are songs and poems attributed to David the musician. The boy David plays for the king, and Saul is comforted. Saul takes to David and he becomes Saul's armor bearer, as well as someone who plays when Saul seeks to relieve his troubles. It's here where we encounter the story of David and Goliath. The Philistines are camped against Israel, they on one ridge, Saul and his army across from them on another, with a valley in between. But it seems neither side has the heart to fight at the moment. The Philistines are led by Goliath, a literal giant of a man, strong and fully armed for combat. Goliath taunts the Israelites twice a day for 40 days, stepping out and daring Israel to send out a champion to fight him one-on-one for all the marbles. But obviously, no one wants to accept that challenge. David, King Saul's armor bearer, splits time between the front with Saul and working at home, tending to his father's flocks. He has 3 older brothers serving in Saul's army, and his father asks David to take some food and provisions back to the front with him. I mentioned before that Saul is the first king of Israel, but prior to that, Israel was still a collection of independent tribes. And when they had to face a problem like the Philistines, they had to muster volunteers at their own expense to meet and face the greater threat together. David's 3 brothers are among these volunteers, and that's why David is bringing them food and provisions. When David arrived, this ragtag army was mustering to battle, and David rushed forward to meet with his brothers. It's there that he hears Goliath taunting Israel once again, and he sees his brothers and the rest of their army tremble in fear in front of him. Who is this filthy Philistine that he should defy the army of the living God, he asks. David's eldest brother warns him, "I know you're only here to see the battle and the presumptions of your heart." David responds with, "What did I just do? I was just asking a question." But David's questions make it to the ears of the king, and Saul sends for him. David tells Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Let me go and face him." Saul dismisses the idea for obvious reasons, but David presses. "I've fought and defeated both lions and bears in defense of my father's flock. This Philistine is no greater than either of them. The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul relents. He offers David his own armor and sword, but the boy can't even walk in it. David removes the gear of war, picks up his shepherd's staff, and collects 5 smooth stones from the ground. I'd like to point out that this won't be the last time God's warrior will face swords with a shepherd's staff. Goliath sees David and mocks him and the rest of Israel. "Am I a dog that you come to meet me with sticks?" Then he tells David to come near and meet his end. "I'll give your body to the birds of the air and the animals of the field." David answers, "You came to me with sword and spear, but I face you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you to my hand, and I will cut off your head. And it will be me that gives your dead body and your army to the birds of the air and the animals of the field. So all the earth shall know there is a God in Israel, and that God does not save by sword and spear." Goliath has heard enough, and he moves toward David. Instead of shrinking, David steps forward in kind, takes a stone out of his pouch, and slings it at Goliath. The stone finds its mark, hitting Goliath in the forehead and sending him immediately, face first, to the ground. Thud. David has no sword, so he rushes forward and takes the giants. Then he removes Goliath's head. The Philistines watch all this in stunned silence as this unfolds, then flee for their lives. The army of Israel, on the other hand, rushes after them like a dog chasing down a wounded rabbit, killing as many men as they catch and chasing them as far as they can before returning and plundering their camp. David collects Goliath's head and all his gear, keeping the armor for himself, but carries his head to Jerusalem to be displayed as a trophy of victory. Saul's son Jonathan is impressed with David's courage and faithfulness and becomes his close friend. The boy David is appointed head of Saul's army, with even Saul's servants and advisors approving, and he finds immediate success in the campaign. But as Saul and David return to Jerusalem with Goliath's head in their possession, Saul is immediately troubled once again. The people are celebrating and singing songs about their victory, but Saul hears them singing, "Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s." They're back in Jerusalem for a single day when Saul slips into another depression and David is once again playing to ease his mind. In a fit of anger and rage, Saul grabs a spear and throws it at David. But David eludes him. Twice. Saul could no longer look upon David because he understood the Lord was with him, but no longer with himself. So he sends David away to lead his army, where he finds continual success. Despite this attack by Saul and many more in the years to come, David never abandons his absolute loyalty to Saul. Saul was appointed by God as king, period. That's good enough for David, even though he's been appointed by Samuel to eventually become the king. David will defend Saul no matter what he does. There's even a remarkable story of Saul hunting down David with 3,000 men and unknowingly trapping him in a cave that Saul was using to relieve himself. 1 Samuel 24. David's already been told by God that Saul's army will be delivered into his hand, and David's men suggest that this is the day. But David doesn't kill Saul. Instead, he cuts off a piece of Saul's cloak. Lord forbid that I should do this thing to the Lord, my Lord, appointed. David scolds his men. Then he follows after Saul when he leaves the cave, and he bows down, showing him that he could have easily killed Saul if he wanted to, but he didn't. Know for certain that there is no wrong or treason in my hands, even though you seek to kill me. Saul immediately recognizes the truth and tells David, "You are more righteous than I am, for you have repaid me good where I have repaid you evil." It isn't until Saul is killed in battle that that David ultimately accepts and assumes his place as king of all Israel. But back to today's story. David is an immensely confident boy. He has already done some pretty remarkable things before encountering Goliath. So he sees the giant as just another lion or bear to take down. I know from personal experience that confidence is sometimes mistaken, especially by those who are fearful, as arrogance. But I can tell you there is a huge difference between a person fully believing that with God's support that they can do anything and believing that you're better than somebody else or other people. It's humility that pivots or tips between confidence and arrogance. There's an outstanding quote about humility that I've shared with you before, and I'll repeat here again. Humility isn't thinking less about yourself. Aw, shucks, I was just lucky. It's thinking about yourself less. It still isn't all about you. Mark Twain once mused, "It ain't bragging if you can do it." David isn't arrogant like his brother suggests when he approaches Saul with the offer to face Goliath. He isn't bragging when he tells Saul he's faced bigger, more frightening threats when he was even younger. He isn't looking for fame or a glorious, heroic death when he steps out into battle. If you read the story, you see David considers facing Goliath with sword and armor, but quickly realizes that's not going to be any advantage to him. But he does still have a plan when he steps forward. Looking for and gathering some stones, he's just going to do what he's always done, facing whatever challenges and threats in front of him, however he can, with whatever he has, and having faith that God will see to the rest. David loved God, and God in turn loved David. But David's love and supreme confidence didn't make him perfect. There are a multitude of stories involving David, and not all of them are favorable. We know he defeated Goliath and became a great king, fathering Solomon, Israel's greatest ruler and the man God allowed to build a temple. But David also made some pretty huge mistakes. He had an adulterous affair with a trusted lieutenant's wife, then had his friend murdered to cover it up. We'll talk about David in greater detail sometime later next year. But the big takeaway for now is not his mistakes and sins, but the fact that he always acknowledged, accepted, and even made penance for those sins. God loved David, not because he was perfect, but because every time he made a mistake, no matter how big it was, David owned it, often publicly. David sought forgiveness, and David accepted God's punishment for it. What problems in your life seem huge, frightening, insurmountable? What problems are you facing that have caused you to sit tight in your safe place, like all of Israel did, while they watched day after day as their problem revealed itself and taunted them? What problems does your spirit tell you that you can overcome if you just trust and have faith that God will be with you as you face it? And do you have the love, the faith in God to step forward and face that problem or challenge in any way you can, as you are, with what you have, believing that God will see to the rest? Amen. Next week we're going to be talking about Solomon, David's son. The title thus far is "Even the Smartest Guy in the Room." ... The reading is 1 Kings 3, but the reflection for the week, if you would do it, is what would you ask for from God? Our closing prayer. Lord, thank you for the many gifts, the many blessings in our lives. You are always there, although we don't always see you. You are always ready, although we're not always aware that you're ready to act. Fill us, Lord, with awareness of your presence at all times, and confidence in your presence to face the challenges that you are placing before us, that we, as your servants, can perform and face those challenges as an example of your mighty, mighty power in this world and in the next.